Good morning, everybody. It's 9 o'clock, and 9 o'clock is with me, Father Warner. We are in Friday of the 23rd week in Ordinary Time. Our text today is taken from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 16 to 19. And I'm going to also cover up chapter 8 and 9. But since our text only covers up I'll read the text that is for the liturgy of today, and then I will recommend that you first, in fact, even shut down this video, read chapter 8 very clearly, read chapter 9, and then carry on. But let me read the text for you. If I proclaim the gospel, this gives me no ground for boasting. For an obligation is laid on me, and woe to me if I do not proclaim the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, I am entrusted with a commission. What then is my reward? Just this, that in my proclamation I make the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free with respect to all, I have made myself a slave to all, so that I might win more of them. The word of the Lord. So, as I said, even though the text at the Eucharist of today just covers up a couple of verses, just 3 verses in chapter 9, I want to recommend that you read chapter 8 and 9 several times, and then approach today's teaching, or else you might catch the proverbial bull by its tail, okay? And I don't want you to do that. The teaching in this text are relevant and important for us as Christians in India. It's not meant to disparage any other religion. It's what does my faith teach me with regard to food offered to idols. And you'll see this in chapter 8, and then tomorrow I might just do also chapter 10, which talks about idolatry itself. Yeah. Now, let's look at where chapter 8 and 9 fit in. Chapter 8 and 9 is part of a larger section. So, the larger section is chapter 7 to chapter 16, and chapter 7 of 1 Corinthians to chapter 16 is really a form of a question and answer session. There are questions to certain doubts streaming in the minds of the Corinthians, and Paul has decided to answer these questions. Now, the questions that you'll see in chapter 7 onwards range from celibacy and marriage to separation and divorce. It talks about food offered to idols, to the conduct of the Corinthians at congregational meetings, and so there are several issues that it takes. Now, before I tackle the text of today, I said, as I promised yesterday, I want to look at chapter 8, which has an issue that may not directly have consequences on Western Christianity. So, all those watching abroad, it may not directly affect you. The issues that affect Western Christianity are not the ones that affect Eastern Christianity. We live in a pluralistic society. So, they may not have consequences on the Western Christianity, but it certainly has an impact on us here in the East, and in particular in India, and that is namely the question of, can I have food that is offered to the idols? Yeah, in India we call it prasad. Yeah, what is offered to the idols is a prasad within the context of a puja. Now, in Corinth, as in other cities of Paul's days, the public and private worship of many deities of the Greco-Roman world included animal sacrifices. And you'd see that slaughterhouses, even in Corinth, were often located next to the temple. So, temple and slaughterhouse. Now, part of these slain animals would be consumed by the altar fire, but the leftovers might either be given to the priests or other worshippers to be sold in the marketplaces. Now, some persons or some people would use these portions of the consecrated food to also give banquets at home, or in the banquet is given even in the temple, yeah, in honor of a god. And persons were then invited either to the home or to the temple to partake in this feast, to eat in communion, therefore, with the deity. Now, Corinth was known in the first century as what we would call a quintessential pagan town. And it would have been very difficult for the believers in Christ to live in Corinth in a manner completely separated from the world around them. To say, let me give you an example. You may live in some parts of Bandra which are entirely Catholic, and you're not really influenced by any other person. But you may live in Parel, and you may be the only Christian family with a number of Hindu families around you. Corinth had people from all religions, and the Christians were really a minority. Now, some Christians at Corinth therefore had a very simple or a simplistic solution to the problem that they faced. So, they held, and pay attention to this carefully, they held that the whole range of questions relating to should we eat such meat offered to the idols or not, they felt this whole discussion was of no consequence. If one ate or did not eat, he was none the better or none the worse. You will see this argument made in verse 8 of chapter 8. Now, keep in mind that when Paul deals with the community also, he always tries to establish a behavior that takes into account both the fact that the believers in Christ live inside the world but are also clearly separate from it. This is a principle. Now, let's come to Paul. In principle, Paul seems to be voicing his basic agreement with the premise of some of the Corinthians that what you eat, even if it is offered to the idols, is of no consequence, because Paul says we do not recognize the existence of their idols. To use his words in verse 4, he says no idol in the world really exists. Paul says this. No idol in the world really exists. There is no God but one God. Okay? So, the Corinthian Christians may have reasoned also like this. If idols are really nothing, then it means nothing to eat meat sacrificed to nothing idols. And it must mean nothing to eat also in the buildings used to worship these nothing idols. Now, Paul himself says, food will not bring us closer to God. He says we are no worse off if we do not eat and no better off if we do eat. Now, this is the principle that Paul is advocating. He is advocating this please understand this very carefully. He is advocating this because he says, if I do not accept an idol as a God, then it is irrelevant whether I eat something that is offered to that idol or not. And this thought was shared by the other Corinthians also. Clear about this? Let me say this again. He says, if I do not recognize an idol, if I do not recognize idols as God and I only accept one God, then what food I eat offered to them or not offered to them is irrelevant. But this is in principle. However, and this is an important however, so please do not listen to the first part of my teaching and not come to the however. And that's why I said this is a very important however. This knowledge that some of these Corinthians had and Paul had, this knowledge or this ability to understand that these idols mean nothing and I have only one God, this knowledge is not understood by all. And those who understand this, that it doesn't affect me at all, may flaunt it in the face of those who are scandalized by it. And as a consequence, they become a stumbling block to those Christians who are weak in the faith. You'll find his argument in verse 9. So, let me explain again. Paul says, that idol means nothing. I believe only in God. So, whether I eat that meat or don't eat that meat offered to the idols is nothing, because the idol itself means nothing to me. That God means nothing to me. But that knowledge only I have, says Paul. And maybe a few who are knowledgeable understand it. But to the greater good of people, they don't understand it. And if I, Father Warner, go and do this, then others who have not fully understood, watching Father Warner do it, will be scandalized. Their faith will be shaken. Because I have that knowledge, but they don't have that knowledge. So it is clear that the weak man, and he's talking about the weak, that's the term he uses, the weak man to whom Paul refers to, it is clear that he is the Christian with an uneasy conscience about anything associated with idol worship. Yeah, and many of our Catholics have an uneasy conscience. I myself am uncomfortable, I'm very uncomfortable with it. Yeah. To the man of knowledge and understanding, yeah, to those who have that and they say, well, it doesn't make any difference because I believe in God. To that person who is being given this knowledge and understanding, they may look at these weak brothers or sisters, they may look at them, they may appear to them, these weak brothers and sisters may appear to be over scrupulous. They may condemn them, but please don't do that. You see, the knowledgeable brother, the one who says, I have only one God and it doesn't matter what are these idols, this knowledgeable brother, says Paul, may argue that if I have adequate knowledge, that adequate knowledge should dispel once and for all these absurd fears. Yeah. But Paul knows that there were several new converts from paganism to Christianity who could have been scandalized by the behavior of a few, of some, and misunderstand their acts of eating such meat even as a sacrilege or apostasy. So you get what Paul is saying? Paul is saying you may have good knowledge. You may know that there is one God. You may know that of eating meat offered to these idols, whether you eat or don't eat, is irrelevant. You may even with that knowledge start scoffing at others who are simple in the faith. You may scoff at them and say, come on, stop being so scrupulous. But Paul says, hey, you have been given that knowledge, not all. And when you do this, you will influence others and scandalize them. And they don't have that knowledge. They don't have that ability to think like you think. So let me say this. In principle, Paul says, it is not evil for anyone to purchase this idol meat. I'm talking about the Corinthians. It is not evil for anyone in principle to purchase this idol meat and eat it in one's home or somebody in anybody's home. But he says that's in principle. But he says in practice, and this is important, he says, but in practice, some persons by doing this, yeah, by eating this meat offered to idols will lead others into a relapse into paganism, or you will lead these weak brothers and sisters into confusion of their faith. Yeah, if Father Warner, who has the knowledge and the understanding that this food offered to idols is nothing, yeah, I know that, I have that knowledge, but I still do it, and many Catholics watching me, they will be left confused. So Paul makes the principle clearer now. He says our actions therefore can never be based only on what we know to be right for ourselves. We also need to consider what is right towards our brothers and sisters in Jesus. It is easy for a Christian to say, I can answer to God and God alone, but to ignore his brother and sister, yeah, is unfair. It is unfair. You have to realize that we live in a world where there are others also. So it is true we will answer to God and God alone, but we will answer to God for how we have treated also our brother and sister. So if our actions are going to cause scandal to our brothers and sisters, we should not eat meat offered to idols. Am I clear about this now? In principle, I know it makes no difference because I believe in God. But not everybody has that knowledge, says St. Paul. I'm repeating this again and again. Everybody doesn't have that knowledge. If you have that knowledge, don't scoff at simpler people in the faith. Don't scoff, says Paul. You have been blessed with that knowledge. However, in principle, by eating that, nothing's going to change. But in practice, when you eat food offered to idols, what happens to everybody else? They are confused. Yeah, I decide to go for a dandiya and I'm dancing there, and some people say, it's only a dance. It's not a dance. You're dancing before an image of their goddess. Yeah, and you're dancing for that goddess. Please understand what you're doing. You may be a knowledgeable person and say it's only a dance. Yes, but somebody else who is watching you, another Christian, is scandalized because you are actually dancing in front of a goddess. And Paul will say, in practice you are disrupting the community. Stop it, stop it, stop it. Now, that was chapter 8. Now let's come to chapter 9, which is really the text of today. But you'll see why I have spent so much of time on chapter 8, because it concerns us. And later on I'm going to do about idols also. That's on another day. Now, let's come to chapter 9. Paul now takes on a new concern in chapter 9. That's where we will find our text. Now, remember the context. Paul addresses the Corinthian Christians about their right based on knowledge to eat meat sacrificed to idols in what I would call a temple restaurant. Yeah? They had temples and then they would serve the meat offered to. Paul asked them, what is Paul saying? Can you please let go of your right to eat meat sacrificed to the idols? And he says, look at me, I have also let go of my own right, my claim to be an apostle. But Paul will also use the occasion to defend his apostolic possession before some of those doubting Corinthian Christians. Now, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The work of God among the Corinthian Christians was enough evidence of Paul's apostolic credentials. In fact, they were the seal of Paul's apostleship in the Lord. The Corinthian Christians had more reason than most to know that Paul was a genuine apostle, because they had seen his work, they had lived with him, they had seen his work up close and personal. Yet there were some in that Corinthian community who doubted him as an apostle, and they questioned even his right. I mean, they started questioning his right to what kind of food he ate and what kind of drink he had, and whether Paul had a right to have a wife or not. Remember, I said Paul previously had a wife, he chose to live celibate, but Paul says, if I take a wife, what's your concern? Their concern was that they would now have to be supporting Paul and Paul's wife, just as they were also. So Paul's wife would then have to be supported by the Corinthian Christians along with her ministering husband. Now, most of the other apostles, including Peter, received support from the churches they ministered to. Remember, Peter had a wife. So in those days, Peter received support, Peter's wife received support. When it came to Paul and Barnabas, some Corinthians attacked Paul. They questioned what he ate, they questioned what he drank, they questioned whether he should have a wife, not have a wife, and Paul says, why can't I? Now, here's the unique thing. Paul and Barnabas were very unique because they chose to work and support themselves. And he does this, he says, so that no one can accuse them of preaching for a money motive. Yet, even though they declined to be supported financially by the Corinthians, still, even then, even though Paul says, I will not take money, they were still reviled by some in the Corinthian community. Even though Paul himself declines financial aid, he makes a very strong cause. He says, you don't want to give me, that's fine. Don't give me, I'm earning my own money. But he makes a strong case for any other minister who's preaching the word of God to be supported. He says, if we have sown spiritual goods among you, is it too much if we reap your material benefits? That means to say, if we are ministering to you, is it too much for you to look after your clergy? That's what he's saying in effect. It wasn't that the Corinthian Christians refused to support anyone in ministry. The problem with the Corinthians is that some among the Corinthian Christians refused to support only Paul and Barnabas. And then, ironically, they began to think less of Paul and Barnabas, because in their mind they said, well, you're not even receiving money from us. So it was damned if you do and damned if you don't. Now, just as strongly as Paul affirms his right to be supported by the people he ministers to, he says, I don't want your money, but I have a right to it. He will also affirm his right to not use that right. Especially, he says, if using that money that you are giving me may hinder the gospel of Christ. Yeah, if I know that that money is coming from perhaps dubious means, and it will hinder the gospel, or because of that money I will have to be obligated to this family or that family. But Paul does not deny, and I want to say this again, Paul does not deny. Paul says, I don't want the money for my ministry, I will earn my own money. But Paul does not deny a minister the right to receive a living. On the contrary, he will say that it is the command from the Lord himself. Remember, the Lord said a laborer deserves his wages. Now, remember that, as I said, Paul had the right to be supported, but he did not use that right. He shows them the value and the reasons for giving up one's right. He preached the gospel, a command that was laid on his shoulders, and he was able to do that without asking his hearers for support, because Paul's ministry was not just a matter of choice or personal ambition. It was something he was called to, something he had to do. He did not just have, what we call a preacher's itch. He was called to preach, and he felt compelled to fulfill that call, whether he was paid for it or not. Now, in Paul's days, there were a lot of religious entrepreneurs who were out to preach any message to get money, and we have that even today. Lots of prosperity gospel preaching, and then asking and begging for money for themselves. Paul was very happy to distance himself from these by never taking any offerings, so that he says, no one must even think that I might abuse the authority that I have in preaching the gospel. And this itself was Paul's reward. We may not ever be faced with a decision like Paul faced, to accept or to deny support for the good of the gospel. But we have a critical question to answer, and that is this, which I want to ask you and leave you with this. What rights are you willing to sacrifice for the cause of Jesus? So today's been a very long teaching. I'm exhausted myself, especially because of my Bell's palsy and my eye. But I enjoy teaching it, and I teach it with great passion. Listen to this teaching at least twice or thrice, especially the first one. And I will continue to teach. There are other very, very controversial topics. Okay, I say controversial not because the Bible is controversial, but because the world thinks that they are controversial. But the Bible gives us very, very clear teaching. There were also things in chapter 8 which I was unable to teach you, but maybe when we do a detailed teaching once, when I'm on sabbatical next year, I'll take on these books in great detail. So thank you, everybody. Have a blessed day. It's a long teaching, I think almost about 22 minutes or 23 minutes, I'm told. Wilson's indicating how long. But God bless you. Share this video, share it. Let people understand the principle of what Paul says with regard to food offered to idols, and then therefore in practice what we should do, and therefore what we should follow. So no confusion on this. There might be some technical questions that you might have. Many people ask, Father, if I went to an office party, office puja, and they gave me a prasad, can I have it or not? I'll answer those also in the days to come. God bless you, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you to all our donors for the Love, Joy, Hope Foundation. Like this video, share your comments. It takes you a few minutes here. It takes me a lot of time to do this. Few minutes for you to write your comments and hit that send button. Send it to everybody else. Bye-bye, everybody. I'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.